All right, we'll go ahead and get started this morning. We're gonna, like I mentioned before, be shifting to the city of Jerusalem kind of for the rest of this study because there's a lot that happens in Jesus's life in Jerusalem, and as we all know, Jerusalem is a pretty significant city as far as when we talk about the life of Jesus. And think through that. So we'll spend the next 5 weeks kind of talking about Jerusalem. If you want to be turning to Luke chapter 2, that's where we'll start this morning in Luke chapter 2. Um, this will be the last time I point out a new city for this quarter, so we might refer to some other things in previous or in future classes. But we've got Jerusalem down here, so kind of complete the different cities that we'll talk about. From some of the other things that we've looked at, and kind of the central location, like I mentioned, for a lot of things happening in Jesus's life. But if you've had a chance to turn over to Luke chapter 2, I'm going to start in verse 22 and then go down through verse 38. So Luke chapter 2, verses 22 through 38, and then we'll kind of go through bit by bit if you want to follow along. And when the days for their purification, according to the law of Moses, were completed, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male that opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what has been stated in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or two young doves. And there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was righteous and devout, and looking forward to the consolation of Israel. And the Holy Spirit was upon him, and it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. And he came by the Spirit into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to carry out for him the custom of the law, then he took him in his arms and blessed God and said, "Now, Lord, you are letting your bondservant depart in peace according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all the peoples, a light for revelation for the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel." We'll stop there for a second because there's some other things that I would like to read as far as background. But as we see here, kind of to set the stage, a couple weeks ago we studied about Jesus being born earlier in Luke 2, and now Jesus is being presented at the temple, which was the custom of the law. So I wanted us to also take a look at, just by way of context, at Leviticus chapter 12. So we're going to have a couple of passages we're going to read this morning to understand the context, and then we'll kind of discuss it. So if you'd like to hop over with me to Leviticus chapter 12, we can look at one of the pieces referenced here, and then we'll jump over to Exodus to look at the other one. So Leviticus chapter 12, we'll start in verse 1. Leviticus 12:1. And this is the first reference that we see here that we just read in Luke. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, when a woman gives birth and delivers a male child, then she shall be unclean for 7 days. As she is in the days of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. Then on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, and she shall stay at home in her condition of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are completed. But if she gives birth to a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall stay at home in her condition of blood purification for 66 days. When the days of her purification are completed, for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb as a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who gives birth to a child, whether a male or female. But if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or young doves, the one as a burnt offering and the other as a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean. So we see kind of this first part that we read, because if you read Luke 2:22 and following, at first glance, like, if you don't know what we're talking about from Leviticus, verse 23 might be a little confusing as far as like, what does it mean every male who opens the womb? But what that means is the firstborn child, right? So we're talking about Jesus being the firstborn child to Mary, so that there were specific things that needed to be followed and specific processes that need to be followed because of that. And that kind of gives us the context of what we're talking about in verse 22 of what she was required to do as far as purification and everything that went on here. Is what we read in Leviticus chapter 12. And then the last big passage we'll hop over to, and then we'll have most of the context is in Exodus chapter 13. So if you want to turn over there with me, we'll read a little bit more in Exodus 13. And I'm going to read verses 1 and 2 and then jump down to 11. So Exodus 13, starting in verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Sanctify to me every firstborn, the firstborn of every womb among the sons of Israel, among people and animals alike. It belongs to me. And Moses said to the people, Remember this day in which you departed from Egypt, from the house of slavery, for by a powerful hand the Lord brought you out from this place, and nothing with ye shall be eaten. And then let's jump down to verse 11. To kind of understand what all this means. Now, when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanite, as he swore to you and to your fathers, and gives it to you, you shall devote to the Lord every firstborn of a womb, and every firstborn offspring of an animal that you own. The males belong to the Lord, but every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. But if you do not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And every firstborn among your sons you shall redeem. And it shall be when your son asks you in the time to come, saying, What is this? And you shall say to him, With a powerful hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. And it came about, when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord put to death every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from human firstborns to animal firstborns. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord the males, every firstborn of a womb, but every firstborn of my sons I redeem. All right. So that gives us kind of another big piece of context here for why this process was done, right? So we remember in the time of Moses with the plagues going on with Pharaoh, when the Passover happened and the Israelites had to follow specific requirements so that the firstborn would be spared. And so this process was not, just something that God asked for the fun of it. It was a reminder of what he had done for them and that they were supposed to do. And also because of the mercy he had shown for them doing what they're supposed to do, the firstborn of the Israelites, the male, was supposed to be dedicated to God. And so we have all of that background here that I feel like it's very helpful for understanding these first couple of verses. And then I think something else that's interesting, that we read is that we can, assume based on verse 24, the fact that it was a pair of turtle doves or two young pigeons, that Joseph and Mary didn't have a lot of money, right? Because we saw that was the option if you didn't have the money for the other sacrifice. So we get a lot of information about, what was expected of people under the law of Moses to do when they had a child. And this is a lot to keep track of, right, as we read through this. So you can imagine, for anyone who's had children, you have all the normal, like, keeping them alive stuff you got to do, and having the baby and all that, and then you need to remember to do all these things for God, but that's showing priority to him. And I think, an interesting thing that we can think about as we study this is, I don't think Mary and Joseph were tempted to do this, but it's, they know who Jesus is. A lot of the other people don't. We'll see Simeon here does, but to everybody else, they're just following the normal steps that they're supposed to do because they are listening to what God's told them to. So nobody else that's watching this process necessarily knows, like, oh, this baby is special. I think even like Patsy mentioned it a week or two ago, like, as far as like people in the community or people seeing them, they're just like, this is a normal baby. We don't know what they're going to do in life, anything like that. But Mary and Joseph know. And so it would be, maybe something that crosses their mind of like, do we need to go through all these steps? We have the Son of God here, like, but we see that they continue to do that, and we'll see farther on as we study about Jesus and what he does in Jerusalem, that he still does what he is asked to do and what he's supposed to do, even though he's here for a mission, because that was what he was coming to do, of knowing the law, fulfilling the law, all of those things. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind, as we study through this. But I think that context is helpful for us to understand. Why do you think Luke here in these first couple verses emphasizes so much that like Jesus's family followed the law kind of to a T? Why was that important to call out versus just assuming they would have done all the right things? Anybody have thoughts on that?
Because they were keeping the law and doing what they were supposed to do from day one.
Right. Yeah. I think that like shows to us today a good example of like there's nobody who is so special that they're above what God asks them to do, even his own son and the people who are like taking care of his son and his earthly parents. And so I think that's important. I think a couple other things that came to mind is I was looking through this to answer that question is he, is showing that he identifies as an Israelite. His family identifies, as these people he's going to come out of who are ultimately going to reject him. He is still doing what he's supposed to there. And to show that like the ultimate redemption he's going to be able to provide comes from, him fulfilling the old law. But in order to do that, the old law is still in place. So, yeah.
Well, it would have been sin.
Yeah.
And if he was sinless, it's
right.
prophesied to be sinless. So,
yeah. That's a good point too, as far as like, no matter who he was, the law was still supposed to be followed. And so we can see that, and that helps us as we've studied other things to know like the things that the things that truly were needed to do because of the law, he did do. The things that the Pharisees and others had added hedges around later on or said, why are you doing this on the Sabbath, or different things like that. Jesus wasn't in the violation of the law, when he was doing those things. So I think that's all good context. Any other thoughts before we keep reading?
Yeah, I would think even fewer Jews would have converted had it not gone through the process that it did.
Yeah, it helps them to see, Jesus didn't follow the exact path that they would, but like of him fulfilling the law, and him being the, his sacrifice, and what comes because of that being what the whole Old Testament was pointing towards, him coming and doing what he needed to do so everyone could have salvation. Yeah.
I had always, I guess, maybe assumed, I'm not sure, that he was 8 years old when he went to it, but obviously not, if they were keeping the law. Because Mary, the passage you read earlier said was to stay in her house for 30 days. So, although the New American Standard doesn't say stay in her house.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, what really happened there. I just assumed that he went to the temple on the 8th day, and they offered a sacrifice and did the circumcision.
Yeah, because
not what happened.
I didn't read verse 21, but that's where it talks about what you're referencing when 8 days were completed, so that it was his time for circumcision. So they follow, that.
But then this event is something
Then
different.
there's like a gap, even though it's verse 21 and 22 in the Bible,
Right.
since they're following what what Leviticus said, and we've got a gap here. So I think that's a good point, because a lot of times it's hard to distinguish that when we read, two verses that are right next to each other. So, yeah.
I don't know exactly what the situation is today. Like, my wife was a lunch lady for a time and had to harass people, not harass, but get on families for filling out the paperwork for free and reduced lunch.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was a kid, there was some stigma associated with getting free and reduced lunch.
Yeah.
And kids seemed to know, and they could make fun of other kids. And I would just use that as a comparison here. Jesus and his family had to take that clause for poverty. I mean, it was like it was something people would know.
Right.
You could not afford a real sacrifice. You had to take the the
Right.
government reduced option.
Yeah, and it wasn't like something that would be hidden, especially with the animals, and like it wasn't something you could just like, go over. Yeah,
And so not only was he not born in a palace, this is even in addition to that, and like even beyond. So he can associate or he can empathize with everybody. Like he grew up in poverty.
good point.
I remember for a short while when John moved here after he got laid off from WPS, I was in Illinois with Caitlin and Miles, and they ended up needing to have free and reduced lunch or whatever. And Kate goes through the line, and the lunch lady says to her, you get free, and you're not supposed to get that. You get free, and so everybody in the whole line saw it, and she was very embarrassed. She was like, what was she in? She was in 7th grade.
Yeah, and that can be tough on kids and parents alike. First of all, the situation you're in with like needing the assistance, like you probably got a lot of things going on, like you mentioned life events. And I think that's a good reminder as we see Jesus here, who is dealing with this, for us not to, try to avoid finding ourselves in a place where we look down on people who might not have as much as we do, right? Like, because Jesus was even in this situation, and there's nothing to, because sometimes we can look at people and say, why don't you change your life situation or find a way to make more money? Or, the phrase I heard a lot growing up was like, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? Like, and there's value to, working hard, and that I'm not saying that we don't ever need to do that or help people get on the right track there. But I think we also have to remember that, like, we're supposed to show love as Christians and support people. And, this is a great, not example of that, but like seeing that, like Baxter mentioned, like where Jesus was brought up, if we acted like that, we could have been acting like that to Jesus if we were looking down on someone who was less fortunate or something. So I think we need to, be careful about how we act there, because clearly, like, from what we see, Mary and Joseph weren't doing anything wrong to end up in that situation, So I think those are good points. Let's keep going. I already read a little bit of this next kind of chunk talking about Simeon here. So we have Simeon, who we read here as he's a man that was just and devout, and he was it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he wouldn't see death before he had seen Jesus, essentially. So we see here, in verse 26 that it's, or in verse 27 that he came to the temple by the Spirit. So we see here that he's like led to be here at this same time so that he can see Jesus. And he essentially takes him up in his arms and blessed God and said, what we read in the subsequent verses. So I thought this was an interesting scene for us to think through too, because I kind of alluded to earlier, like for the most part, when Mary and Joseph bring Jesus into the temple, nobody else like recognizes him and said, oh, this is the Son of God, like has that recognition, to them, just normal baby following the normal process. But we do have someone, because of what they've been told and promised and because of their faith, that knows that they're, and then the Holy Spirit ultimately tells them to go to the temple, that does recognize who Jesus is, right? And so that recognition happens, and I just am very interested. We don't have all of the things that were said back and forth between him and Mary and Joseph, but we see here that he, in verse 28, takes Jesus in his arms and blesses God, right? And so, like, just to see this scene unfold of the Simeon, who Mary and Joseph are very likely not to have known who he was, and be like, hey, can I hold your baby? Like when they're going through this process, and they probably could tell from his look and his demeanor, like how, much he understood about this. And so I imagine, he was saying that, or like, some conversation happened there probably for them to know that he knew kind of the importance of the baby that they had with them. And then he goes on to say, Lord, you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepped before the face of all peoples, a light to bring revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. And so we see here that a couple things that he already knows about Jesus, like that he's going to bring salvation. He's going to be prepared for all people. He's going to be a revelation to the Gentiles, so it's not just going to be for the Jews. And so, this is interesting foreshadowing that we already know, or like there's already been prophecies about some of these things as well. But that Simeon is aware of these things, and it's just interesting as far as like what he knows there. And then we have verse 33, which is kind of Joseph and Mary marvel at these things which were spoken of. So, like I said, there's some conversation going on here. We see what Simeon says there. And then in verse 34, he goes on, he blesses Mary and Joseph and says to Mary, behold, this child is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign which will be spoken against. Yes, a sword will pierce through your own soul also, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. And so, we know from what we've studied some already in Jesus' life, what we will study, and just what we know of the New Testament, that, Jesus is going to cause a lot of things to happen, right? Like ultimately he's here to be the perfect sacrifice, to be that atonement for us. But because of his nature and what he's here to do, we see a couple things that are going to happen as far as like the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed, right? Like we've seen that through some of the things that we've even studied, where Jesus has been able to know what's going on in the hearts and thoughts of those around him. But also his teaching is going to force people to make decisions, right? Are they going to recognize who he is and do what they're supposed to do? Or are they going to continue to follow Judaism or follow whatever life they're in and not do that? And we know from, other classes and other sermons that we've heard that like hearing the gospel, understanding who Jesus is, should change our hearts, should cause us to behave differently, but also can cause division in families or communities or different places because of that. So we see all of that that's going to happen, because Jesus came, and because, of this baby that Simeon is holding here in front of him. A lot of different things are going to happen. So anyway, we talked through a lot there. Any other thoughts before we keep going? Yeah.
I think maybe most of us have heard, and unfortunately, I might have even said it myself, that there was 400 years of silence between Malachi and like John the Baptist. But I think this passage reminds us that is not true.
Yeah.
Yes, there were no books that were written, but God was definitely not silent. During that time, the Holy Spirit communicated to this guy.
Yeah.
We also know that Anna is described as a prophetess in that next section.
Yeah.
So God definitely communicated to people during that time. Well, we just may not have a record of everything he said.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a really good point, as far as, when we look back on this, thinking that through. Any other thoughts before we keep going? Yeah.
In these verses, we also gotta keep in mind the Holy Spirit, power of that. It's got the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
I think it exists then, and I think it exists today. Granted, it's nothing tangible, but I wholeheartedly believe that the Holy Spirit still exists. And it comes and goes, but the tighter you get to Jesus and His Word, I think more times you frequent that.
Yeah.
So to speak, if that makes sense.
Right. And it's hard to say the exact specifics of what transpired here, but even if we think about what we studied here with the Holy Spirit versus what we've seen for previous studies of like angels appearing to people, right? Like both of the, like clearly in some way the Spirit moved, told something, we don't know exactly how, Simeon to come to the temple for this, right? But it was different than what we've seen for other passages where an angel would appear to someone in a dream or directly tell them, and even what we'll study as we get farther into like the crucifixion and things like that. So it's interesting to me as far as like the different ways that God chooses to like communicate with people back then and even communicate with us today, right? Because I don't know that I've ever had, well, I can say with certainty that I have never had an angel appear to me in a dream and say, go do this, this, and this, right? But like looking back on life, like we've talked about before in previous classes, I do think through prayer and like God working through our lives that he does, influence the things that we do, and that the Spirit, if we are doing what we're supposed to, will help, direct us. But I don't think it's I think sometimes we read passages in the Bible and we think like, oh, they had, like I've even mentioned before, like, wouldn't it be nice if God would directly tell us what to do from an angel or something like that? But I think to what you're bringing up here, like, we are equipped to have some of those things if we are like reading the Bible and we are doing what we're supposed to and praying thoughtfully about things. Yeah.
Paraphrasing the opening verses of Hebrews, the Hebrews writer says, in times past, God communicated in many different ways, but now God has communicated to us through his Son.
Yeah.
And so we no longer have the Holy Spirit, nudging us or giving us a private message. There's none of that today. What we have now is Jesus communicating through his word. Like, he delegated that authority to his apostles, who then wrote things down.
Yeah.
And now I would say the Holy Spirit communicates to us through the written word.
I think that's a fair point. With some of what I was saying might have been a little vague there, but yes, for like the communication we have from God, it is through the word that we read throughout the New Testament. So I think the communication that we have directly, and then how we talk to God, is through prayer. So there, is that kind of back and forth that we have. And, we have references throughout the New Testament about specifically what the Spirit does for us. So I think that's helpful for us to keep in mind too. Let's keep going just for the sake of time to read the last couple things, as Baxter mentioned, about Anna the prophetess. So let's read verses 36 through 38 together. In Luke chapter 2, we'll be back over in Luke for the most of the rest of class. Luke chapter 2, verses 36 through 38. And there was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years and had lived with her husband for 7 years after her marriage. And then as a widow to the age of 84, she did not leave the temple ground, serving night and day with fasts and prayers. And at that very moment, she came up and began giving thanks to God, and continued to speak about him to all those who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. So like Baxter already mentioned, we've got this reference to the prophetess Anna, who is, serving as someone who is talking about what God has presented to them. And we see, I had to read through this a couple times to understand some of what we're talking about here, as far as like, at the time we're reading about her, she was advanced in years. From my understanding of reading through this, she'd lived with her husband for 7 years, and then proceeded as a widow from that time on. And so I was trying to understand why was this specifically mentioned. And I think that is to show, her devotion to God. Like, a lot of times people would have tried to remarry for the things we talked about in previous classes, as far as like, it was hard, especially at that time, for women to be on their own and to be able to support themselves, just because of how the culture of the time was and things like that. But from my understanding, and interested if other people have thoughts, this is showing like her devotion to the temple and to doing what she needs to do for God, is why could be a reason why she chose not to remarry, and that's why we have that mentioned here. So she's serving day and night, she's at the temple. And I think the interesting thing here is she comes at this moment too, and she's giving thanks to God, and then proceeds to speak. We can assume, because she's mentioned as a prophetess, that she has talked about the things that are coming. And she, in verse 38, continues to speak about him being Jesus to all those who are looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. So she is trying to help with the transition that is coming, which would be the role of a prophet or prophetess, to say, here are the things that God has, told me, or that we need to be looking forward to about, Jesus coming. And here we have that Jesus is here as a baby. And so like saying like the redemption that will come to Jerusalem for that, and the looking forward to that, is what we should have her presenting here. So that's kind of a quick snippet about that. I'll Anybody have any quick thoughts on that before we keep going? Yeah.
Sort of like in the other thing we were talking about, but I was just thinking, God answers prayers, but sometimes he doesn't answer them when we want them answered. And sometimes we can look back and see when the prayer was answered, but we don't know, we don't notice it then.
Yeah. I think that's, very easy to have happen in our lives because we, especially if you're caught up in a situation or you're stressed about something like, you don't see when it's going on in the moment, but like looking back in hindsight, it's a lot easier to see. Any other quick thoughts? I know I blew through that really fast. I want to try to, I probably won't get through all of class today, but we can at least cover the rest in Luke chapter 2. All right, let's keep going with verses 41 through 50. So we're going to jump down a couple verses and talk about kind of Jesus' next trip to Jerusalem when he's 12. So Luke chapter 2, verses 41, and we'll go ahead and read through 50. His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning, after spending the full number of days required, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of it. Instead, they thought that he was somewhere in the caravan. They went a day's journey, and then they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Then after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When Joseph and Mary saw him, they were bewildered, and his mother said to them, "Son, why have you treated us this way? Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." And he said to them, "Why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my father's house?" And yet they, on their part, did not understand the statement which he had made to them. So we kind of leave off with what we just read about, Jesus as a baby, and then we jump forward in time to the point where he is 12 years old. We already referred to the Passover a little bit in Exodus chapter 12, so that's the feast that they are here for, and they come up with Jesus for that, so we won't go reread kind of that context. And so they spend the number of days that are required, and we kind of are probably most familiar with this story, but Jesus stays behind in Israel and his parents are unaware of it. So kind of to paint the picture, they've made, the journey from Nazareth, which we've talked about up here, down to Jerusalem, and they're going to head back, and they don't realize that Jesus isn't with them kind of from the outset. There's a number of reasons that we don't specifically have written here that could have happened, right? They were probably traveling with a group of people, and it would have been expected that he would have come along, but they might not necessarily have checked that he was there, or just assumed that he was there. So this could have happened as a part of that, and they just assumed that, and so they headed off on their journey, and they started looking for them and weren't able to find him. And so I think they reacted like most parents would in this situation. When that you're missing a child, you're going to immediately start panicking and try to figure out where are they. So they head back to Jerusalem to find him, and as we can all imagine, this is probably a pretty frightening experience for them, right? Because it's also not like today for us, where, if this did happen and we left a kid somewhere, we can probably drive back in 15 minutes, right? Like you can imagine they're probably trotting or even running. I mean, we don't see that, but they're trying to hurry to get back to figure out where Jesus is. And we can imagine kind of the scene of panic and why that might play into some of how they respond later on. But yeah.
Game with Walt Smith,
Mm-hmm.
and Anne was already nervous, but we had Jordan with us, and Jordan was 7 years old, and Walt managed to lose Jordan at a Mailers game, and Anne was not happy.
Yeah, see, I was good. My brother had a way of wandering off at games. I never misbehaved or anything, but there were a number of times where we would get out to the car, we need to meet up at the car after this, and we'd have to go back and find Jonathan, and it'd take 30 minutes, and so panic ensued.
When the boys were in kindergarten, we went on a field trip to the zoo. And one of the mothers went with us and we lost her kid. And the teacher said, I've never lost a kid, and especially when the mother was there.
And you might, as the teacher, let your guard down a little bit because you're assuming the mom would keep track there. Yeah.
I just picture the Home Alone.
Yeah, probably a lot of commotion and different things going on that leads to this. It wasn't just like, okay, everybody line up and go. There was a lot going on, and a lot you had to coordinate for a trip like this. I mean, even for us today, when we're making a road trip or taking a flight somewhere, there's enough to think about, and they probably had even more things to think about as provisions and keeping themselves alive and stuff. So a lot going on there.
And then it was 3 days before they found him when they got back.
Yeah. So very stressful situation. And then they come back and he's sitting in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. So in verse 47, we see all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. Why do we think that was? How would have he been presenting himself such that they would have been amazed and astonished at his answers? Yeah, so he's 12. And from what we can tell, he's talking, like he's one of them. What is the how do we think this presents itself, practically speaking? What's the difference of what you would expect from a 12-year-old versus how he's answering them? Yeah.
I think to begin with, you don't expect him to stay in the temple. You expect him to be out playing in the creek or whatever.
Right. So where he is and what he's doing, right? Hey, I'm hanging out with what most kids would say is the boring people, right? Talking to them about stuff. So that's, one level of thing. Another thing I was thinking about, from my own experience, growing up in the church is a lot, I understood things, but I would say a lot of things that I understood were more I could regurgitate facts, but maybe not have a deep understanding of everything that had happened. So if you asked me, to name the 12 apostles or something like that, I could do that, but I might not be able to tell you, if you asked me why do you think Peter did this in this specific instance, unless I had been taught, I was coming to understand some of those things on my own, but I would not have been able to talk for 3 days with, people about all of these things back and forth. And so I imagine that's some of the specifics that are going on here is you would not expect a 12-year-old child to be able to carry on a conversation like this. They might start to have some understanding of deeper topics and things that aren't just kind of regurgitating facts that they've learned, but not to the level of being able to do this for 3 days straight. That would be, amazing. And, it's very likely that he's even challenging what they think, right? He's not even just listening to the conversation and repeating some of the deep things, but he's presenting new things potentially even that they haven't heard, And again, we don't have the specifics of the questions or what they were discussing, but as we think through why they would have been impressed, it is likely that kind of scenario, yeah.
Questions also speaks to his understanding.
Yeah.
I teach kids karate as kind of a part-time gig, and they have questions, but they're in no way, shape, or form related to the subject matter. So why don't snakes have feet? And,
Right.
Well, great, but I don't know. But let's get focused. He probably had questions that were related to subject matter. So I think that also speaks to kind of this level of maturity in the situation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as far as thinking through, how typical interactions with children go. Yeah.
Previously, that they might have known him, know who he was and who his parents were, and it's not Joseph's son, right?
Mhm. Yeah. So you got that. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, one of the YouTube viewers says, try to imagine a 12-year-old that knows as much or more than you do. That this would have been the case.
Right. Yeah. And there's all sorts of insecurities that might happen if you're getting kind of, shown up for all this by a 12-year-old, or they're able to kind of like talk on your level too. So I think we got a lot of different things going on there as far as how amazing this was. And I think this goes to show like, you know, even before we get to the point of like Jesus performing the miracles that we did for the, you know, to show the authority and the authenticity of who he was, we had the prophecies that pointed forward to him, right? And like people could put some things together like we saw Simeon do, or Anna, or different things, but also just with interactions with Jesus when he wasn't doing anything necessarily like miraculous here, people could tell that there was a difference about Jesus even as a 12-year-old. And I think that that's interesting as well. And that doesn't mean, oh, I should just believe that someone is the Son of God because they can talk intelligently about a subject. But I think we can start to see like differences in Jesus, you know, kind of as we put together thinking of him as like, he's a human, but he's also the Son of God. And so he still has to grow up just like we do and like learn things just like we do. But there's also a difference to him versus like what we would expect of a normal child growing up. So I think that was all interesting as we see this kind of event transpire. And then we kind of get to the last part of this passage where Joseph and Mary, you know, finally find him and they're bewildered. And Mary's like, son, why are you treating us this way? You know, we've been anxiously looking for you. And then he responds with, why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house, is what the New American Standard says. Or I think what we probably more commonly know is, why did you seek me? Did you know that I must be about my Father's business? I think is probably what a lot of us are more familiar with. So kind of getting at like the mission that Jesus was here to do. He's about his Father's business. And then it says, they on their part did not understand the statement which he had made. And then I think it's very interesting to me, you know, kind of thinking through the idea of like in verse 50 and 51, that he went down with them and came to Nazareth and continued to be subject to them. So we see Jesus, even though he spent this time, you know, in Jerusalem, like I think a lot of us, you know, you've seen movies or TV shows where there's like a child prodigy, right? And they're really intelligent in something or whatever, that like maybe they go to private schools or maybe they like go off somewhere or something like that. And this isn't the exact same situation, but to draw parallels, like one thing they could have done is they could have either immediately moved to Jerusalem, or Jesus could have stayed behind and learned from the people at the temple or something like that. But that wasn't the plan, right? That wasn't what was supposed to unfold at this time, even though Jesus even says here, I'm about my Father's business, I'm in my Father's house. Like he recognized, one, the authority that his earthly parents had over him, but also that the plan wasn't for him to just stay in Jerusalem and, you know, build up knowledge and reputation and you have fame amongst these teachers, right? There was a plan, you know, and we don't know what went on year to year in his childhood life, but he also knew that he needed to be subject to his parents and go back to Nazareth with them. So I think that's interesting for us to kind of ruminate on and think about, you know, this week as well, as far as like recognizing like the authority that his earthly parents had, but also kind of him following the plan that was set out before him. So like I mentioned, won't have time to cover the last chapter. I'll pick that up next week. Luke 19, we'll pick up there. Any last thoughts on that before we close? I'm already over on time, but I'll take one or two if anybody has thoughts they want to mention. All right, if not, thanks for a good class.